let me say this straight, because the mainstream headlines are either sugarcoating this or deliberately burying the lead. What just happened between Donald Trump and Canada is not some routine diplomatic conversation. This is the closest we've seen to a sitting US president privately begging a foreign leader in modern history. And the last time an American president looked this desperate in private while projecting strength in public, you have to go back to the final days of Nixon. Yeah, and we all know how that ended. So before anyone starts screaming that this is just normal back-channel diplomacy, I want you to understand something. Desperation has a pattern, and Trump just checked every single box. Now, here's the part that should make every political observer sit up in their chair. Over the last 24 hours, Donald Trump didn't hold a rally. He didn't post some chest-thumping message on Truth Social. He didn't parade in front of the cameras. No, he reached out privately to Canadian officials through emergency diplomatic channels. And when a former US president who's running for office again starts moving in complete silence, that's not strategy, that's panic. That's the sound of poll numbers landing on someone's desk and making them realize the public bravado doesn't match the private reality anymore. Because here's the truth nobody in his camp wants to admit. There is a growing chasm between what Trump is saying at rallies and what he's doing behind closed doors. And that chasm just became a canyon. Think about it. If Trump truly believed his tough on Canada stance was winning him support, why would he need a secret diplomatic plea? Why not keep the rhetoric rolling, keep the pressure building, keep the political theater going? The answer is brutal. Somewhere inside Mar-a-Lago, someone ran the numbers. Someone looked at the polling collapse in key swing states, the donor panic, the international humiliation, and the growing backlash from American business leaders. And they realized this thing could cost him the election before it even starts. And that's when the call happened. This isn't normal diplomacy. This is damage control, a strategic retreat, a quiet surrender wrapped in diplomatic language to test whether Canada is willing to help him save face. And let me tell you something, folks. Presidential campaigns don't do that unless the bleeding is real. So the question isn't, did Trump beg? The question is, what exactly did Trump ask for? Because what he asked for tells you everything about who just lost this fight. And once you hear the details, you're going to understand why this isn't a story about Trump negotiating with Canada. This is the story of Trump trying to stop the global humiliation before it destroys his campaign. And trust me, the request he made was not the request of a man who thinks he's winning. All right, so now let's get into what Trump actually asked for, because this is where the entire narrative explodes. The media wants you to believe Trump is still the tough negotiator, still the deal maker, still putting America first, like it's some kind of political masterstroke. But what Trump requested behind closed doors tells a completely different story. And it's not the story of a man projecting strength, it's the story of a man begging for mercy. Here's what he proposed. Not a policy discussion, not a strategic realignment. No, Trump asked Canada for a public statement of support. A joint declaration saying Canada respects his leadership and believes in continued cooperation. Public support, not a trade deal, not a security pact, just words that make him look legitimate again on the world stage. That right there is your first red flag. Because if Trump truly believed he was still a respected global figure, he wouldn't be begging foreign governments for endorsements. He'd be commanding respect, not requesting it. But it gets even more pathetic. Trump also asked Canadian officials to avoid publicly criticizing him during the election cycle. Avoid criticism, not engage in debate. Again, notice the language. He's not asking for dialogue or discussion. He's basically saying, please stop making me look bad while I'm trying to win. That's not diplomacy. That's desperation. And then comes the third piece, and this is where the humiliation becomes undeniable. Trump wanted Canada to coordinate messaging with his campaign, to help frame any future interactions as evidence of his strong international relationships, the classic political theater where both sides pretend everything's fine so the weak one can claim victory back home. It's the kind of arrangement politicians beg for when they know they're losing and need anyone to make them look credible again. Now listen carefully, because this is the part most analysts are completely missing. When a presidential candidate asks a foreign government to help him campaign, that candidate is not winning. You don't beg your critics to stay quiet when you're surging in the polls. You ask for that when you realize the wheels are coming off, and you need international cover before the voters catch on. Trump wasn't asking Canada for cooperation. He was asking Canada for a political lifeline. That's what this was. A campaign rescue operation disguised as diplomatic outreach. And honestly, it makes perfect sense. Because if Trump goes into this election being mocked by international leaders, the moderate voters will abandon him, the foreign policy establishment will crucify him, and the Democrats will run nonstop ads showing him being rejected by America's closest ally. So what does Trump do? He tries to get a fake win, something he can point to like a prop, even if everyone knows it's meaningless. But here's the problem. Canada didn't just say no. Canadian officials rejected him in a way that was surgical, professional, and absolutely devastating. Because the way they refused wasn't just a rejection, it was a statement to the entire world. And Washington clearly didn't see it coming. Now, this is where Canada completely destroys Trump's narrative, and I mean that literally. Because most countries, when they reject an American president's request, they do it quietly. They leak it to friendly reporters. They use diplomatic language. They try not to embarrass the superpower. They play nice. They say no comment. They avoid creating an international incident. They manage the relationship carefully and make sure nobody loses face too badly. Canada didn't do any of that. They didn't stay silent. They didn't hedge. They didn't even pretend to consider it. Instead, Canada did something far more devastating for Trump, something that doesn't just kill his narrative, but exposes it completely. They responded with transparency. Canadian officials basically said, "We received an inappropriate request from Mr. Trump's team asking us to provide political support during his campaign. Canada does not interfere in American elections. We do not endorse candidates, and we do not coordinate messaging with political campaigns. We stand by our principles, and those principles don't change based on who's asking." In that order, not maybe later, not let's discuss this, not let's find common ground. Those principles don't change, period. And that right there is the diplomatic kill shot, because Canada didn't frame this as a political feud. They framed it as a matter of democratic principle. And once you do that, you change the entire conversation. You don't fight a principles war with political pressure. You don't win a principles war by making threats. You win it with consistency, integrity, and moral high ground. Trump can rage on social media all day long. He can attack Trudeau, mock Canada, claim they're weak, whatever he wants. He can go full America first and make speeches about being disrespected. But he cannot spin his way out of being rejected on principle. He cannot bully Canada into abandoning its standards, and he cannot force them to make his humiliation look smaller. In fact, the harder Trump pushes back, the more pathetic the original request looks. Because every attack makes it seem like he's lashing out after being told no. Every escalation looks like the guy who got rejected at the dance and can't handle it. And let me tell you something, that plays horribly with undecided voters. That's not presidential behavior, that's not leadership, and it's definitely not the image of strength Trump desperately needs right now. And this is why Canada's refusal is so devastating, because it puts Trump in an impossible position. If Trump stays silent, he looks weak and rejected. If Trump attacks Canada, he looks petty and desperate. Either way, the optics are poisonous the longer this stays in the news. And here's what makes it even worse for Trump. Canada didn't even have to be aggressive. They didn't have to insult him. They didn't have to gloat. They just calmly stated facts like a teacher correcting a student and basically told the former US president, "We don't do that, and you shouldn't have asked." That is ice cold, and it forces every other country watching this drama to start asking a question that terrifies Trump's campaign. If Canada can say no to Trump using principle instead of fear, what stops Germany from doing the same? What stops Mexico? What stops any ally that's tired of being treated like a campaign prop? And the real kicker is this: Trump's outreach was supposed to make him look like a statesman, but Canada's response made him look like a beggar instead. And the moment that became obvious, the global reactions exploded, and those reactions are the most honest thing you're going to see in this entire story. All right, let's talk about the one thing that never lies, doesn't spin, doesn't care about loyalty, and definitely doesn't care about what Fox News or Newsmax wants you to believe. The international community, because world leaders may be diplomatic, but they're not blind. And in this situation, global reactions basically exposed the truth in real time. The second news broke that Trump had privately begged Canada for support. Foreign policy circles erupted, diplomats started talking, allies started reassessing. And why? Because they interpreted Trump's secret plea as proof that his campaign is in serious trouble. They didn't see it as Trump being strategic. They saw it as Trump being desperate. That is critical because if world leaders believed Trump was strong, they would have stayed neutral. They would have said no comment, internal American politics, not our business. But that's not what happened. What happened was foreign officials started quietly expressing concern, not about Canada, but about Trump's judgment, about his stability, about whether he understands boundaries anymore. And that shift in tone from cautious neutrality to open concern tells you something brutally clear. The international community was hoping Trump would fade away quietly. They were hoping American voters would reject him, so they wouldn't have to deal with 4 more years of chaos. Not because they hate America, but because they remember what governing with Trump was like the first time. Leaders don't panic at the idea that Trump might lose. Leaders panic at the idea that Trump is so desperate he's breaking diplomatic protocol to save himself. And if you think that doesn't matter, you're not paying attention, because international credibility is the currency of global leadership. You can't demand respect while begging for endorsements. Now, here's where things get even more explosive, because while the public is distracted by Trump's usual distractions, something is happening inside the Republican establishment that should terrify his campaign. In the 48 hours after the story broke, 4 senior Republican foreign policy advisors went on record distancing themselves from Trump's approach. Now, let's be clear. They didn't attack him directly. They didn't call him unstable. They didn't praise Canada. They used very careful, very coded language. But the message was unmistakable. This kind of behavior damages American credibility, and it damages it in ways that take years to repair. And trust me, Republican establishment figures do not issue statements like that unless something is catastrophically wrong. They don't break ranks unless the damage is too big to ignore. They don't speak publicly unless their donors are furious, their allies are embarrassed, and their own reputations are at risk. That means the panic has reached critical mass. Campaign staff, major donors, party leadership, allied governments, all of them realizing that Trump isn't just controversial anymore. He's becoming a liability. And that's the part Trump's inner circle can't spin away. Canada didn't just reject a request. Canada exposed a pattern of desperation that everyone can now see. So when Trump begged Canada, it wasn't because he woke up feeling diplomatic. It wasn't because he suddenly wanted international cooperation. It was because the walls are closing in, the campaign math changed, the polling data shifted, and begging became the only option left when everything else is failing. And Canada still said no, which brings us to the question that matters. Why would Canada refuse to help? Why not give Trump the tiny win he's begging for? Because Canada understands something that Trump never learned. This wasn't just about one statement. This was about sovereignty. And behind the scenes, while Trump was spiraling, Canada was quietly sending a message that makes bullies far less scary than they used to be. And that's the part that should make Trump's team very, very nervous. Now, here's where the story gets truly damaging. Because while Trump's campaign was busy pretending this rejection didn't matter, Canada was doing something far more strategic, something quiet, something coordinated, something that doesn't make Fox News segments but absolutely destroys Trump's international credibility. Canada was building a coalition, and I don't mean symbolic tweets about shared values. I mean real diplomatic coordination, real allied messaging, real synchronized responses. While Trump was melting down on Truth Social, Canada was quietly briefing European allies, reinforcing relationships with Commonwealth partners, and coordinating talking points with governments who are all tired of Trump's chaos. That's not grandstanding, that's preparation. That's Canada making sure that if Trump retaliates, he'll be fighting the entire democratic world, not just one country. Because the entire Trump strategy was built on one core assumption, that Canada would be too afraid of American power to refuse him. That Canada would complain quietly, then cave, then issue some meaningless statement, and pretend it meant something. Canada looked at that assumption and basically said, no, we're going to make ourselves untouchable. And that is why their refusal wasn't reckless, it wasn't anti-American. It was calculated strategy. Because helping Trump save face would set a precedent that destroys sovereignty. It tells every future American politician that the way to control Canada is simple. Create a crisis, apply pressure, then demand a favor, and call it friendship. That's a trap Canada would never escape from. So they refused to play that game, and they refused because they're thinking like a sovereign nation, not like a political prop. They're thinking in principles, not in news cycles. And that brings us to the moment we're standing in right now. Because Trump's next move is genuinely unpredictable. There are two paths in front of him, and both of them are disasters. Path one, Trump escalates, more attacks, more insults, more conspiracy theories. The goal would be simple: punish Canada for refusing and prove he's still in control. But if he takes that path, Canada releases more details. The humiliation deepens. Both his credibility and his campaign take massive hits. And we start moving towards something nobody in his camp wants to talk about: the November 2024 election. That election is not some abstract future event. That's the moment when American voters decide whether they want 4 more years of this chaos,